Margaret had known grief before, but nothing prepared her for the kind that comes with betrayal attached to it. 31 years in that house. 31 years of birthdays celebrated at that kitchen table, of Christmas mornings in that living room, of quiet Sunday afternoons with Robert reading the paper while she tended her garden out back. And now she stood on the porch of it all, holding a single cardboard box, listening to the sound of a locksmith drilling out the front door lock behind her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Margaret ended up on that porch, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a woman who never expected her life to unfold this way. Margaret grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a school teacher and a factory worker, raised to believe that hard work and honesty always won out in the end. She married young the first time, a marriage that ended quietly after 6 years, with no children and no drama, just two people who had grown into different versions of themselves. By the time she met Robert, she was 32, self-sufficient, and no longer interested in fairy tales. What she found in Robert wasn't a fairy tale, it was something steadier than that. Robert Whitfield was the kind of man people described in exactly the same way, no matter who you asked. Quiet, reliable, the sort of person who fixed a neighbor's fence without being asked and never mentioned it again. He worked as a machinist for almost 30 years at the same manufacturing plant. The kind of job that doesn't make headlines but pays a mortgage and puts food on the table without complaint. He wasn't flashy with affection, but Margaret always said he showed love in verbs instead of words. He changed her oil every 3 months without being reminded. He learned to make her mother's soup recipe after her mother passed, just so Margaret wouldn't lose the taste of it. Their marriage settled into something comfortable within the first few years, the kind of comfortable that outsiders sometimes mistake for boring, but insiders know is actually the hardest thing to build. They never had children, a fact that used to sting more than either of them admitted out loud, but over time it simply became part of the shape of their life together. What they built instead was a home, modest but paid off, and a marriage that didn't require an audience to feel complete. Margaret often told her sister that those years with Robert were the calmest of her entire life, and she meant it every time she said it. But calm, as Margaret would eventually learn, does not mean untouched by outside forces, especially when those forces come from family. Robert's family had never been simple. His father, a stern man named Harold, had spent decades openly favoring Robert's 2 older brothers, Gary and Dale, while treating Robert like an afterthought who happened to share the family name. It wasn't cruelty exactly, at least not the kind anyone could point to directly. It was smaller than that. It was who got asked for advice at holidays and who got asked to pass the potatoes. It was whose achievements got announced at dinner and who's got a polite nod before the conversation moved elsewhere. Robert never complained about it, not once in the 11 years Margaret knew him before his diagnosis. He simply absorbed it the way he absorbed most things in life, quietly, without drama, filing it away somewhere Margaret couldn't see. She noticed it, though. She noticed the way Gary's wife, a sharp-tongued woman named Denise, would make comments at Thanksgiving that sounded like compliments but landed like insults. She noticed the way Dale, the youngest brother, would joke about inheritance and money in front of their aging parents with a casualness that made Margaret's stomach turn, even back when there was nothing at stake yet. One Christmas, years before anyone got sick, years before any of this began, Dale raised his glass at dinner and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, that when their father eventually passed, he hoped things would finally get split up fair this time. Everyone laughed except Robert. Margaret remembers watching his jaw tighten for just a second before he smiled and changed the subject, the way he always did. She asked him about it later that night, and he simply said that Dale liked to talk big when he'd had a few drinks, and that it didn't mean anything. Margaret let it go. She wishes now that she hadn't, because looking back, that Christmas seemed to mark something, even if neither of them recognized it at the time. Not long after, Robert started taking trips into town that he didn't fully explain. Nothing dramatic, nothing that raised alarm bells in the moment. He'd say he was running errands, handling some paperwork, taking care of a few things. He'd come home in a button-down shirt on a Tuesday afternoon when he normally would have been in his work clothes, and when Margaret asked where he'd been, he'd give her a vague answer and ask what she wanted for dinner. She never pushed. That simply wasn't how their marriage worked. Robert was private about certain things, and Margaret respected that privacy completely. Those quiet trips continued on and off for years, so gradually that Margaret never thought to track them or question the pattern forming underneath her own roof. It's only in hindsight, only after everything that happened later, that she pieced together just how long Robert had been quietly preparing for something. Nearly 8 years by her best estimate. 8 years of small, careful, deliberate moves that Margaret had absolutely no visibility into, made by a man who apparently understood his own family far better than she ever gave him credit for at the time. Robert's health began to decline when he was 61. It started small, the way these things often do, with a cough that lingered longer than a normal cold, and a tiredness he kept attributing to age and long hours at the plant before retirement. Margaret pushed him to see a doctor for nearly 4 months before he finally agreed, mostly to stop her worrying, he said, more than out of any real concern for himself. The diagnosis, when it came, moved fast and left almost no room for hope. Stage 4. Aggressive. The oncologist gave him somewhere between 4 and 8 months, depending on how his body responded to treatment. Robert took the news the way he took everything else in his life, with a kind of unsettling calm that Margaret both admired and quietly resented in the moment, because she was falling apart and he seemed to already be thinking 3 steps ahead. What she didn't fully understand yet was that Robert wasn't in denial. He was simply already executing a plan he had started building years earlier, one designed specifically for a moment exactly like this one. While Margaret grieved the diagnosis in real time, Robert quietly began finalizing whatever it was he had been working on in secret for nearly a decade. Robert's family, to their credit, showed up quickly after hearing the news, though Margaret would soon question what exactly they had shown up for. Gary called within the first week, not to ask how his brother was coping with a terminal diagnosis, but to ask whether Robert had gotten his affairs in order, and whether the house situation had been sorted out the way it was always supposed to be. Margaret remembers standing in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, feeling something cold settle into her stomach that had absolutely nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a growing unwelcome suspicion. Harold, Robert's father, visited twice during those first difficult months. Both times, he brought up the house and the family's expectations regarding it before he ever asked his son how much pain he was in or whether he was scared. Margaret sat through both visits, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white, biting her tongue for Robert's sake, because the last thing he needed during those months was a war with his own father over property while he was actively dying in the next room. Robert, for his part, simply nodded along and said he'd take care of it, the same way he always had. As the months went on and Robert's health worsened, the visits from his side of the family increased sharply, which Margaret initially mistook for genuine concern before she understood the pattern underneath it. Denise started offering to help manage the finances, a suggestion Margaret declined immediately, something about the timing feeling deeply wrong even though she couldn't articulate exactly why at first. Dale showed up twice, uncharacteristically attentive, asking pointed questions about paperwork, about accounts, about whether Robert had updated anything recently. Margaret began to feel like she was watching a group of people circle something, waiting patiently for the moment weakness finally became opportunity. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Margaret holding his hand and sunlight coming through the blinds exactly the way it always had on ordinary mornings in that house. It was, by every measure that matters in moments like that, peaceful. Margaret would later say it was the last peaceful moment she experienced for well over a year afterward, because the war for everything Robert had built began almost immediately, before she'd even had the chance to properly grieve the man she'd shared her life with for over a decade. By Thursday, only 2 days after Robert's death, before a funeral had even been scheduled, Gary showed up at the house holding a folder of his own. He didn't offer condolences first. He offered paperwork, an old joint deed from decades earlier, one that predated Margaret's marriage to Robert entirely. A technicality buried in aging documents that Gary claimed gave the family rightful legal standing over the house Margaret had lived in for 31 years. Margaret was still in her robe. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since Robert passed. And already, without pause, without mercy, the fight for everything he'd built was fully underway. Margaret called a lawyer the following morning, a woman named Deborah Klein, who came recommended by a friend and who had, unfortunately, seen this exact situation play out more times than either of them would have liked. Deborah reviewed the joint deed carefully and delivered the news as gently as the truth allowed. The document was old, but it was technically valid, and its wording gave Gary and the rest of the family a legitimate legal claim, at least on paper. Fighting it would take time, money, and a level of emotional endurance Margaret wasn't sure she had left in her, especially while still raw with grief. Within days, a for sale sign appeared on the front lawn, placed there before Margaret had even fully moved her remaining belongings out of the garage. Bank accounts she'd assumed were simply shared between her and Robert turned out to have complications neither of them had ever fully discussed, outdated beneficiary forms, and old paperwork oversights that the family's attorney seized on almost immediately. Margaret felt, in her own words later, like she was drowning inside someone else's carefully laid plan, one that had apparently been years in the making, on the other side of this fight, long before she ever understood a fight was coming. Rumors began spreading through the family almost as fast as the legal paperwork did, the way rumors always do in situations exactly like this one. One cousin whispered that Robert had secretly accumulated gambling debts nobody knew about. Another claimed there was a second will somewhere, one that supposedly cut Margaret out of everything entirely. A neighbor 2 doors down swore she'd once seen Robert meeting a woman downtown months before his diagnosis, a rumor that spread through the family group chat faster than anyone bothered to verify it. Margaret chased down every single one of these stories out of sheer desperation. Every single one of them led absolutely nowhere. What she did eventually find, buried at the back of Robert's closet behind a row of old winter coats, was a small metal lockbox she'd genuinely never noticed before in over a decade of marriage. Inside it sat a single storage unit key, a business card for an attorney whose name meant nothing to her, and a sealed envelope with a name written on the front that she didn't recognize at all. She sat on the edge of their bed holding that envelope for nearly 20 minutes before she found the nerve to open it, hands shaking, unsure whether she was about to find comfort or an entirely new betrayal. One family member broke from the pack during all of this, quietly, almost apologetically. Robert's sister-in-law, Dale's wife Carol, pulled Margaret aside during a particularly tense gathering and said something Margaret didn't fully understand at the time. She said that Robert wasn't stupid, and that whatever the family thought they were doing, she didn't believe it would go the way they all expected. Margaret asked her to explain further, but Carol simply shook her head and said she'd already said more than she should have, then walked away before anyone else noticed the conversation had happened at all. 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, Margaret drove out to the storage facility alone, holding a key she'd found hidden in a lockbox in a dead man's closet, with absolutely no idea what she was about to walk into. The facility sat on the edge of town, the kind of place most people drive past without a second glance. She found the unit number matching her key, hands trembling as she lifted the metal door, bracing herself for she didn't know what. What she found inside was smaller and stranger than anything she'd imagined on the drive over. There was no furniture inside, no boxes of forgotten belongings stacked toward the ceiling the way she'd pictured, just a single filing cabinet, a folding metal chair, and a manila envelope resting on top, almost as though Robert had left it there specifically for her to find. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a stack of documents she had never once seen in her entire marriage, centered around a property deed dated nearly 8 years earlier for a small piece of land 2 hours outside the city that Robert had mentioned only in passing, a modest rental property the family had long dismissed as the old place, barely worth the paperwork required to sell it. Except this deed wasn't in Robert's name, and it certainly wasn't part of his estate. It was held inside a trust, one established almost 8 years earlier, with Margaret listed as the sole and irrevocable beneficiary. The paperwork was airtight, drafted specifically to sit entirely outside the reach of anything connected to Robert's main estate, including the very joint deed Gary had used to seize the house. When Margaret called the attorney listed on the business card, he confirmed everything within minutes of hearing her name, as though he'd been expecting this exact phone call for years. He told her that Robert had come to him nearly 8 years earlier, not long after that Christmas dinner where Dale made his comment about things being split up fair, asking a single, simple question. He wanted to know how to make sure something could never be touched, no matter what happened to everything else he owned. The attorney had structured the trust with exactly that goal in mind, and Robert had quietly funded and maintained it for the better part of a decade, all while smiling through holiday dinners and pretending none of the undercurrent in that family had ever bothered him at all. Margaret sat inside that storage unit for nearly an hour, holding the deed in her lap, finally understanding every quiet trip into town, every locked drawer, every vague answer Robert had ever given her about taking care of some things. He hadn't been keeping secrets from her out of distance or distrust. He had been quietly building a wall around the one thing he could still protect, specifically so that she would never have to fight for it the way she was now fighting for everything else. The house, in the end, was lost. The land nobody wanted never was. The legal battle over the house dragged on for the better part of a year, and in the end, the family's claim on that old joint deed largely held up in court, exactly as Deborah had warned Margaret it might from the very beginning. Margaret lost the home she had shared with Robert for over 3 decades, packed into boxes, and moved into a modest rental across town, while the house she'd built a life inside of sold to strangers for less than the family had originally hoped, thanks to months of accumulated legal fees eating steadily into their expected profit. For nearly a year afterward, Margaret let the old property sit exactly as Robert had left it, unsure what to do with land she'd never even visited during their entire marriage together. It wasn't home. It wasn't the life she had planned for herself at this age. It was simply, undeniably hers, and for a long time that felt like enough just to sit with quietly while she rebuilt whatever pieces of her life remained standing after everything else had been picked apart by people who were supposed to love her husband unconditionally. Then came a phone call Margaret genuinely wasn't expecting. A land management company had apparently been trying to reach the property's legal owner for nearly 2 years, long before Robert had even passed away. After a routine geological survey revealed mineral rights attached to that stretch of land. Rights nobody in the family had ever bothered investigating because to them it had simply always been the old place, not worth the paperwork. Robert, it turned out, had known. Buried in his files, Margaret later found a survey report dated years earlier, proof that he'd quietly had the land assessed not long after first placing it inside the trust. He hadn't just protected a piece of property that his family considered worthless. He had protected something none of them ever knew existed in the first place, something valuable enough that a company had been trying to track down its rightful owner for years, while the family fought bitterly over a house that ultimately brought them far less than they'd originally imagined. Meanwhile, that same family was slowly unraveling in exactly the way greed tends to unravel, once the thing being fought over finally changes hands. Gary and Dale, once united in their pursuit of what they felt was owed to them, began fighting bitterly with each other over how the proceeds from the house sale should actually be split. Harold, their father, stopped speaking to both of his remaining sons entirely within a year of the house being sold. The details of that particular falling out never fully shared with Margaret, though she'd heard enough secondhand to understand it centered on money, the same as everything else in that family always seemed to. They had taken everything they set out to take from her, and somehow, when all the dust finally settled, it amounted to considerably less than nothing once legal fees, family resentment, and eroded relationships were factored into what remained. Margaret, for her part, quietly signed an agreement with the land management company several months later, an arrangement that wasn't a fortune by any stretch, but was enough to put a down payment on a small place of her own, enough to stop waking up every morning wondering how she was going to rebuild a life at 63 years old, with almost nothing left to her name. Enough, for the first time in well over a year, to feel like she was finally standing on solid ground again, instead of constantly bracing herself for whatever blow might land next. She visits the old property sometimes, sitting on the porch of a small house nobody in Robert's family ever wanted, on land nobody ever thought twice about, thinking quietly about a man who spent nearly 8 years preparing for a fight he genuinely hoped would never come. Robert never got to see how any of it ended. He never got to watch his family unravel over money the way they had always seemed destined to, and he never got to see Margaret finally land somewhere safe again after everything that followed his death. But Margaret has come to believe, in the years since, that somehow he already knew exactly how it would end. Greed, she says now, only ever sees what's directly in front of it. It reaches for the largest, loudest, most obvious prize in the room, and rarely stops to consider what might have been quietly set aside, out of sight, years in advance, by someone patient enough to see the whole picture before anyone else even knew there was a picture to see. Robert saw his family clearly, long before Margaret ever did, and he built his entire plan around a truth he never once said out loud while he was alive, that the people closest to you are sometimes the ones you have to protect yourself from the most carefully. So we'll leave you with this question tonight. If you were standing in Margaret's shoes, married to someone quiet, private, and careful in ways you didn't fully understand until it was almost too late, would you have noticed the signs along the way, or would you have trusted family completely, right up until the moment it cost you everything you thought you had? Let us know what you think really happened behind closed doors in that family, and whether you believe Robert planned this from the very beginning, or simply learned, over time, exactly who he was dealing with.